The success of The Killing put its young director Stanley Kubrick on the radar of Hollywood movers and shakers. Kubrick and his producing partner, James B. Harris, wanted to capitalize on their momentum and get another project into development, and in short order they acted on Kubrick's desire to make another war film after the self-perceived failure of his last go at the genre, 1953's Fear and Desire. Kubrick remembered a book he had read when he was 14, Humphrey Cobb's seminal World War I novel Paths of Glory, and subsequently enlisted Harris to license the film rights.
Well, Colonel, what do you think of it?
What do I think of what, sir?
The anthill. Colonel, your regiment is going to take the anthill tomorrow.
You know the condition of my men, sir.
Oh, naturally, men are going to have to be killed. Possibly a lot of them. They absorb bullets and shrapnel. And by doing so, make it possible for others to get through.
What support will we have?
I have none to give you.
The resulting screenplay, written by Kubrick, Calder Willingham, and The Killing's Jim Thompson, aroused the fervent interest of Hollywood superstar Kirk Douglas, whose participation afforded the filmmakers a budget of $1 million. While it was the biggest budget Kubrick had worked with to date, it still wasn't a huge amount of money by 1957 standards with which to make a sweeping war film. Nevertheless, Kubrick and company soon found themselves in Germany shooting Paths of Glory, a hard-hitting examination into wartime ethics and the moral conundrums that arise when there is too much investment in an ideological struggle.
Come on! Give it another try!
Paths of Glory takes place in France during World War I, where the warring factions of France and Germany have dug themselves into sprawling networks of trenches while enduring an agonizingly long stalemate. World War I was a pivotal point in history. Innovations like trench warfare and biological weapons rendered the type of genteel, civilized combat, like the kind seen in Kubrick's later film Barry Lyndon, utterly obsolete. This meant that antiquated notions about honor, valor, and bravery were in need of updating to meet the standards of this brave new world. But rigidly disciplined institutions like the military don't adapt easily. As such, when 3 Frenchmen are sentenced to death by their own commander for the crime of cowardice, Douglas's Colonel Dax finds himself with the odds stacked against him as he defends innocent men against the military's bloodthirsty crusade for vindication. As the idealistic and virtuous hero of Paths of Glory, Douglas takes every opportunity to chew the scenery.
I apologize, sir, for not telling you sooner that you're a degenerate, sadistic old man. And you can go to hell before I apologize to you now or ever again!
His working relationship with Kubrick, while paying dividends for both men's careers, was reportedly contentious at best. They challenged each other in a way that only 2 men who truly shared a mutual respect could. Unlike a great deal of directors, Kubrick rarely worked with the same actors over multiple films, and only Douglas holds the distinction of headlining more than one Kubrick film, speaking volumes as to the nature of their stormy, yet fruitful, working relationship. Adolphe Menjou and George Macready form something of a two-faced antagonist, as a pair of well-decorated, vindictive French generals.
If those little sweethearts won't face German bullets, they'll face French ones!
Macready's performance as the scarred, ruthlessly vindictive General Moreau is particularly notable for its dark, Kubrickian irony, that of a man who will dress himself up in the colors of honor and patriotism to justify his twisted agenda.
Snap out of it, soldier!
Ralph Meeker, Joe Turkel, and Timothy Carey portray the 3 condemned men. Meeker gains the most screen time as Corporal Philippe Paris, a disgruntled idealist chosen for the firing squad. Turkel brings an unconventional physicality to the role of Private Pierre Arnaud, one which would help him greatly when Kubrick called on him to play the ghostly bartender in 1980's The Shining.
What would be?
As the self-described social undesirable, Private Farrell, Carey makes his second appearance in Kubrick's body of work after his supporting role in The Killing. This would also be his last time working with Kubrick. His increasingly difficult behavior and bad habit of scene-stealing and unpredictable performances led to Kubrick souring on him. A run-in with the law during the shoot was the last straw for Kubrick and Harris, and they subsequently fired him before he had shot all of his scenes, requiring the use of a body double to finish his performance. Finally, there's Christiane Harlan, who plays the small role of the captive German girl singing to a packed beer house of French soldiers during the film's closing sequence. Her unsteady yet ethereal performance is captivating simply because she is the first female presence that we encounter in the film, and the story literally stops in its tracks to lose itself in her beauty. This part of the film might have been no more than a footnote in Kubrick's filmography had it not been for the fact that he ended up falling in love with this woman, and would divorce his wife Ruth Sabatka a year later in order to marry her instead. This time, The marriage would stick, with Christian and Stanley remaining together until his death in 1999. Shot by cinematographer George Krause, the black and white 35mm film image is artfully composed to fill the 1:66:1 widescreen frame. The film's camera movement is notable in that it is where Kubrick's signature aesthetic truly coalesces and emerges. His use of the dolly, for instance, is compelling and purposeful, often letting such moves go on for a long time in order to establish scope and mood. One instance is the fateful anthill charge, which unfolds almost entirely in one lateral moving dolly that tracks parallel to the action. Another moment takes place shortly beforehand, with Douglas marching down the long trenches in an unbroken shot, while a flank of soldiers look on and explosions rock the ground above him. This shot in particular also shows off Kubrick's affinity for one-point perspective compositions, employed as a way to lure the audience deeper into his meticulously crafted world. Furthermore, Kubrick makes subtle use of zoom lenses during the charge sequence, which introduces an element of documentary to the proceedings, while linking Kubrick to the directors of the New Hollywood School, a generation of filmmakers who made frequent use of zoom lenses in a bid to inject reality and immediacy into their work, while rejecting the polished techniques of their Golden Age forebears.
Und als man ihm die Botschaft bracht, dass sein Herzliebchen im Sterben lag.
In his fourth feature, Kubrick focuses quite acutely on music and its effect on storytelling, acting with a conviction and sense of purpose that was missing from his previous work. More than 5 decades removed from the film's release, we know that Kubrick would become well known for his excellent ear for classical music and its placement in his work. Paths of Glory marks the earliest instance of this aspect of Kubrick's aesthetic, with Kubrick opening the film with a rendition of the French national anthem Marseillaise. He then goes on to include a small number of other classical cues, like Johann Strauss's Künstlerleben Opera 316 during an officer's ball sequence. This image in particular, aristocratic men and women waltzing to classical music in large, opulent spaces, would itself become a recurring motif throughout Kubrick's career. Paths of Glory ruminates quite heavily on the nature of war and violence, a topic that held Kubrick's interest his entire life. The film looks at violence as an agent of discipline, as well as how conflict rooted in ideology causes us to dehumanize the opposition as the other, and justify actions that would seem outright barbaric in the cold light of day.
Maybe the attack against the anthill was impossible. Perhaps it was an error of judgment on our part. On the other hand, if your men had been a little more daring, they might have taken it. Who knows? In any case, why should we have to bear any more criticism of the failure than we have to?
Interestingly enough, Paths of Glory is the rare instance in Kubrick's filmography where the perspective sides with the moral and virtuous character, in other words, the traditional hero. His later works would examine similar ideas about dehumanization and madness, but from the perspective of the afflicted, ultimately giving in to the darkness within. Paths of Glory also sees the beginning of Kubrick's on-screen fascination with Baroque architecture, most notably in the choice of location for the French Army's chateau headquarters. Some might recognize the chateau location as the same one used for Alain René's fundamentally haunting Last Year at Marienbad. Kubrick often frames his subjects in wine shots during these scenes, allowing the ornate gilded interiors and echoing marble halls to overwhelm them with insignificance, while also providing an ironic visual counterpoint to the officer's admittedly barbaric, uncivilized judgment of 3 innocent men. Kubrick also contrasts the spacious royal nature of the chateau, home to the well-fed and well-dressed elite of the French leadership, with the gritty, mud-soaked trenches in which the rank-and-file grunts carry out their orders. The soldier versus officer, pawn versus king metaphor at play here is quite deliberate. Kubrick's love of chess profoundly influences his sense of dramaturgy. Paths of Glory is the first of Kubrick's films to use Baroque imagery to convey salient points about class conflict, but it wouldn't be his last. From 2001: A Space Odyssey to Barry Lyndon, all the way to Eyes Wide Shut, Kubrick's filmography is dominated by this distinct architectural style and the cultural attitude it engenders. Paths of Glory marks a huge step up in Kubrick's development as an artist and a filmmaker. In terms of scale alone, Kubrick proves himself to be the real deal. The complex staging of the central charge sequence shows that Kubrick could handle a grand epic just as well as an intimate heist thriller. Indeed, his next gig would come about precisely because he proved he could handle such a large scale. While it performed modestly at the box office upon its release, Paths of Glory nonetheless holds up today as one of the best war films ever made. An assertion backed up by the Library of Congress when it was added to the National Film Registry in 1992. Everything Kubrick had done up until 1960 suggested an artist who ultimately aspired to large-scale, conventional Hollywood genre pictures. Each of his first 4 features had exceedingly eclipsed the previous one in scope and ambition, and his works on Paths of Glory suggested that he had the chops to successfully take on a big, old-fashioned Hollywood epic. For all intents and purposes, Kubrick proved his bona fides and delivered a successful Oscar-winning picture in the form of 1960's Spartacus.
Rome will not allow us to escape from Italy. We have no choice but to march against Rome herself and end this war the only way it could have ended, by freeing every slave in Italy.
The seed of Spartacus was planted when screen icon Kirk Douglas lost the title role to Charlton Heston in William Wyler's Ben-Hur. The blow to his ego compelled Douglas to set up his own project to rival Wyler's, one that would focus on the classic tale of a slave revolt led by slave-turned-gladiator Spartacus. He would produce the film through his own production company and take the title role for his own. His choice for screenwriter proved highly controversial. Blacklisted writer Dalton Trumbo, who by this point had been living in exile from the studio system after his outing as a communist sympathizer during Joe McCarthy's Red Scare hearings, sustained himself by writing under a series of pseudonyms. Douglas hoped to deal a fatal blow to the integrity of the anti-communist movement by allowing Trumbo to use his real name, proving himself every bit as virtuous and idealistic as the screen heroes he regularly portrayed. Trumbo and Douglas envisioned the biblical Aristora of Spartacus as an allegory for modern-day concerns, like the civil rights movement and the McCarthy hearings, a tactic that undoubtedly gave the film some much-needed relevancy and immediacy.
Your lives are to be spared on the single condition that you identify the body or the living person of the slave called Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus.
Director Anthony Mann was originally hired to direct Spartacus, but after a week of clashing with Douglas and the film's considerable scale, he was unceremoniously fired. Douglas remembered the fruitful, if contentious, working relationship that he had with Stanley Kubrick during the production of Paths of Glory, and so he called on the young auteur to step in and save the film. Kubrick's subsequent realization of Spartacus is a peculiar albatross in his filmography, mainly because it is the only one that doesn't feel like it bears his stamp. Admittedly, it doesn't. For the first, and only, time in his career, Kubrick's contract under Douglas severely limited his creative freedom and mandated the toning down of his aesthetic in favor of an old-school Hollywood epic style. At first glance, Douglas and Kubrick's second consecutive collaboration appears to be even more fruitful than their last. Douglas's towering performance as the proud, virtuous Spartacus is one of the best of his career. With Douglas acting as Kubrick's producer, however, the line of authority between director and star was blurred, and the project quickly became a collision of egos and stubbornness. Kubrick allegedly had a fundamental issue with the fact that the Spartacus character had no compelling faults or quirks. Douglas's impression of Kubrick's artistic integrity took a substantial hit when Kubrick was quick to volunteer his name to replace Trumbo's if the script were to run into trouble with the blacklist gatekeepers. This war of opinions between the two men festered throughout the long, arduous shoot, ultimately ruining their working relationship, if not their friendship, for good.
I promise the living body of Spartacus, for whatever punishment you may deem fit, that, or his head, this I vow by the spirits of all my forefathers.
Kubrick's collaboration with the rest of the cast was not as dramatic, thankfully. Master thespian Laurence Olivier plays the primary antagonist Crassus, with a cool, smoldering demeanor. In the infamous Snails or Oysters deleted scene, Crassus is revealed to be a bisexual, perhaps one of the earliest instances of such a character in cinematic history.
Do you eat oysters?
When I have them, Master.
Do you eat snails?
No, Master.
Do you consider the eating of oysters to be moral and the eating of snails to be immoral?
No, Master.
Of course not. It is all a matter of taste, isn't it?
Yes, Master.
Alicia. Up next.
Gene Simmons plays Spartacus's love interest, a fellow slave girl named Varinia, with a maternal, feminine air that's perhaps a little too glamorous for a slave, but effective all the same. Rounding out the cast is Charles Laughton as the portly Senator Gracchus, John Gavin as a young Julius Caesar, and Tony Curtis as Spartacus's best male friend and fellow slave Antoninus.
Every time I touch my wounds, they sing.
Finally, there's Peter Ustinov as Batiatus, the slave trainer and unexpected benefactor in Spartacus's quest, whose sweaty, breathy performance earned him the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. As it stands, Ustinov would be the only actor to win the Gold Statue for performing in a Kubrick film, a fact that must have incensed Douglas to no end.
In the last century, before the birth of the new faith called Christianity, which was destined to overthrow the pagan tyranny of Rome and bring about a new society, the Roman Republic stood at the very center of the civilized world. Of all things fairest, sang the poet, first among cities and home of the gods is golden Rome.
As befitting a grand Hollywood epic, Spartacus's cinematography is sweeping and colorful. One might even mistake it for a David Lean film, which is ironic considering that Lean was initially approached to direct and turned down the opportunity. The cinematographer, Russell Meddy, was already in place when Kubrick came aboard, and the two men clashed almost instantly. Meddy was reportedly infuriated by Kubrick's demanding pursuit of visual perfection and lack of regard for the cinematographer's creative input. As a result, Kubrick personally shot most of the film himself, his brilliance with light and composition earning Spartacus an Oscar for Best Cinematography, but ultimately it would be Meddy who took home the gold statue on awards night. Shooting for the first time in the anamorphic 2:35:1 aspect ratio, Kubrick uses every available grain of the Technicolor 35mm frame to render a lush, expensive-looking image. Kubrick's first feature in color employs a copious amount of sweeping, crane, and dolly shots to sell the film's scale, but it doesn't contain the same kind of alluring energy that similar shots have in his other, more personal work. Indeed, the film appears to be the work of another director entirely. Many of Kubrick's thematic explorations that have made his other works so rich and creatively potent are mostly discarded here in favor of a straightforward, unironic, and earnest narrative. Like the industrial short The Seafarers before it, Spartacus sees Kubrick working mainly as a director for hire, with little control over the script or the production. However, the film's violent aspects allow Kubrick to indulge in his visual meditations of man's inhumanity to man in the form of fighting to the death for sporting and entertainment's sake. Working solidly within the swords and sandals epic genre, Kubrick nonetheless manages to subvert it in the film's climax, which sees Spartacus and Antoninus fighting to kill each other. Not for the entertainment of others, however, but so as to save the other from an even worse fate on the cross.
Forgive me, Antoninus.
Spartacus was a monster success when it was released, easily becoming Universal's biggest hit of all time, until it was dethroned by 1970's Airport. It received widespread critical praise and won 4 Oscars, but more importantly, it made history when Trumbo's employment effectively ended the blacklist, and prominent politicians, including President John F. Kennedy, disregarded the cries of anti-communist protesters as they stepped inside to see the film. Despite the film's success, Kubrick personally disowned the film. Regardless of his own personal feelings towards the film, Spartacus marks a crucial turning point in Kubrick's development as an artist. Had he been happy with the final product and his overall shooting experience, Kubrick quite easily could have made a career in making supersized epics and become a David Lean type for a new generation of filmmakers. Instead, his need for directorial control, a need that trumped cooperation or compromise, would lead him down a very different path. Spartacus marked the end of Kubrick's old Hollywood phase of conventional filmmaking techniques, with his disappointing experience on the film causing his attention to gaze towards the wave of experimental art films trickling out of Europe. Films that would revolutionize Hollywood and place Kubrick himself at the cutting edge of an evolving art form.